welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Turn the Page podcast. My name
Thanks
is
so much.
Yeah, hi. This is Jessica. Turn the Page podcast, Syosset Public Library. I'm really excited to have the author of the book Wolvish, Erica Berry, here. This is a really interesting book, and I'm going to invite Erica to tell us about Wolvish and just sort of where it came from, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Honored to be in conversation with you. So, Wolfish originally got its start about a decade ago when I was researching the repopulation of wolves in my home state of Oregon for my environmental studies thesis as an undergraduate. And I had grown up in the city myself, but my grandparents were both kind of on farms rurally, and I was interested in the return of wolves that was so controversial. It becomes a very political issue, and I feel like I was sort of interested in wolves as what do they actually represent, because very often when we're talking about them, they become sort of laden with all of these other meanings and projections. And so then it wasn't until a few years later I was grabbed by a stranger on a dark street when I was in graduate school, and that was maybe one moment where suddenly I started thinking about symbolic wolves and Little Red Riding Hood and the stories that I'd been taught about them. And I didn't want to tie wolves to that moment, but I was like, maybe I can't just write about real wolves, because very often, even when real wolves are talked about in media headlines, the symbolic wolf is like there, it's the shadow. And I wanted to sort of explore the relationship, to untangle the symbolic wolf from the real wolf, but also to think about some of those stories I'd metabolized about the wolf, the big bad wolf, and what that meant growing up as a young woman in America. There's many stories around fear and wilderness and freedom and America itself that I thought the wolf sort of helped us illuminate. So it's an exploration into those stories.
And it was broken up into like many different parts, and you talk a bit about what you were just talking about, the politicization and just wolves in general. I come from the East Coast, where that is not something we generally deal with. Wolves are, like these like magical creatures almost. And it's funny because I have a friend who has like 4 huskies, and it is almost like he has a pack of wolves in his
Yeah.
house. But in general, there's a lot of talk about, like how dogs evolved from wolves, and how, like the difference between like, a wolf that could be more domestic versus not. I mean, I look at like something like a Chihuahua. I'm like, how? That makes no sense to me, how one can go from one to another. But in stories, wolves take a lot of us a front and center stage. So you talk about obviously Little Red Riding Hood comes up a lot. Girl versus wolf, town versus wolf, truth versus wolf, country versus wolf, self versus wolf, and mother versus wolf. How did you decide? Well, and you also talk about, and I thought that this was really interesting, because you were talking before about the symbolic wolf. You were talking about some summer camp that you went to, where it was supposed to be like a female empowerment summer camp, and in a way it was more like how it was. I don't know, I have my own interpretation of it. I'll let you talk about it. But how did you sort of start to break this down and do your research, and then how did you metabolize the personal into the research narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, that summer camp, I think, was an example of growing up in Oregon. I'm a millennial, and I sort of came of age of this kind of girl power generation, where it was like, you can do anything. And it was this very hippie kind of, we didn't have grades at my school. I went to a summer camp where we, were just like set out into the woods and told to go like hike by ourselves and find our spirit animal. Like that was our activity. It was very sort of almost new agey in a sense. And I think when I was there, though, they were telling us like men are going to be really dangerous. So like be careful and like don't go on a date with them. And suddenly I was like, this is actually not very progressive. This is telling us that we should live in fear. And I'd never been taught to be afraid. Like my parents really tried to raise me as this like brave, independent woman. And was very privileged as a young girl and adolescent that I didn't really have many of the scary experiences that other young women do. It wasn't until I sort of left the house that I felt kind of aware of the ways that my female body was read by other people and could be I felt like I was inviting situations that I didn't want. Of course I wasn't inviting them, but so I think at some point I was thinking about the wolf in sort of the Big Bad Wolf stories, and the way that if I was going to look at who the wolf was supposed to be in those stories, very often the wolf was constructed based on who it was chasing. And so who is the girl supposed to be in those stories? And it was sort of in looking at how I thought about the symbolic wolf, I started thinking about what I had been taught about fear. And very often I think we talk about how do you grow out of your fears? But I became interested in like, how did I grow into them? How does a girl learn to feel afraid on the street? Because for many years I didn't feel afraid. I lived one of those, gifted childhoods that I didn't have to feel afraid when I was young. And so then so yeah, I guess to back up structurally this book, I started thinking about what was the construction of the wolf? Like, how was that shaped? Okay, there's fairy tales, and the fairy tales are actually tied to really interesting things that are going on politically. And, some of these in Western Europe where kings are paying people to kill the wolves and like they're deforesting the land, and that was all really interesting. Like that shapes the symbolic wolf. And then I had this other thread that was like, what is my relationship with fear in the stories and my own sense of the big bad wolf? And I was interested in these ideas of who gets to be predator, who gets to be prey, how do we think about those culturally? And so it sort of follows a loose chronological trajectory through my kind of coming of age experience. So the book begins with sort of me going to college and some experiences that had happened there, and then sort of moving into my early 30s where I eventually move home. And so I wanted to break down the idea of the wolf is very often talked about on binaries. Like it's a dog versus a wolf. It's a wolf versus a girl in the forest. And as we know with so many binaries, that's sort of false, right? Like what actually does separate a dog from a wolf? That's a really interesting question. It's more complex than I thought. And similarly, like the rancher versus the environmentalist, that's more complex too. And so I liked the idea of structuring the book based around these different binaries, that you're sort of caricaturing them and being like, here's the narrative, like the wolf is out to get your family. Well, no, it's really not. Let's break that down.
So some of the other things I thought were really interesting is you mentioned that in different languages, words for wolf are also words for like robber and evildoer and outlaw. Was like, how did you come upon that information? That is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I really tried to go back to the very beginning of like, when did we start talking about the wolf in this way? Why is it not the big bad bear? Why is it not the big bad cougar? And part of that is that wolves have this tremendous range where they've lived on so many continents, and they sort of, they move, they're quite prolific, and they disperse huge distances. That's what it's called when a wolf leaves its pack. And so they have this really resilient ability to move around. And so in trying to trace like how far back, if I want to like take apart the big bad wolf, how far back do I go? And I found that it was sort of like in very, very early forms of English and other languages as well. It's sort of very ingrained into the codes. And so I think of this book as researched omnivorously. Like I just was not afraid of going into an area that I didn't understand. And that meant going down a lot of rabbit holes. I would use Google Scholar, and some of this was during the pandemic. I couldn't go to libraries. So I was really, on these library research websites. I mean, interesting talking to you at a library, right? Like there's these tremendous resources that you can use archivally of old magazine databases and scholarly databases. And I was just sort of it was like putting my net out there and seeing what would stick related to wolf. And I would find a story maybe written by an ancient Greek scholar about how wolves were sort of conceptualized as battle imagery in the ancient training young ancient Greek male warriors. And suddenly that helps me see, oh yeah, these conflations go back thousands of years. And so, yeah, a big shout out to libraries in the process of researching this.
Yeah, there was a lot of really interesting research into that as well, including just like different versions. You talk about Little Red Riding Hood a lot, and Little Red Riding Hood, some of which, where like certain characters die and certain characters don't die, and that was really interesting too, because I don't like, to me, and I'm a fairy tale person, but for some reason Little Red Riding Hood for me, it's like, well, what I remember from childhood is like, well, there's the bloody version where the huntsman pops the wolf open and takes everybody out who apparently has not been digested, or they're eaten. And I wasn't really thinking about the different nuances of it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I became interested. There's a very early oral storytelling of Little Red Riding Hood where that was maybe originally told, women would be telling it to their daughters, perhaps. There was a sort of had this tradition of a story that was told to help teach fear and teach protection. And in that version, the girl escapes. She basically is with the wolf and she sort of says, I have to go pee. And he's like, you can't do that. She's like, no, 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 really, I have to do. And she goes outside and like leaves. And that felt so revelatory to me. Like that's a story of escape and of cunning. And it creates a totally different girl, I'll put that in quotes. But that idea, and the wolf follows her home, but he doesn't find her. And nobody kills him. There's not like a big, okay, now we're gonna like stone the wolf. It's just she escapes. And I was really interested in how that story later by royalty essentially got changed into a story that taught a different kind of girl. It taught that a girl needed to be saved and that she was going to invite a threat and be too dumb to save herself, essentially. And that to me was like a very toxic thread that actually was not the oldest. So that was
Right,
interesting.
because and then the idea of her like wearing red and having, like, like she's like considered spoiled and wanton,
Mhm,
because she's out there flashing herself out in red and inviting
mhm,
this, yeah.
mhm,
Which obviously is not something, when you're being told these stories, you're not reading between, as a child at least, you're not
mhm,
really reading between the lines, and you don't really, I mean, you don't really think about it in that sense.
mhm,
You're like, oh,
mhm,
like she's wearing red, okay.
mhm,
But this is coming from a very different time and a very different
mhm.
place.
Well, and I think I felt the same way where I was like, I'm not living my adult life thinking like, what would Little Red Riding Hood do? But that story is metabolized in my own narrative of what it means to be maybe alone among strangers. I'm very aware of that. And there were, a couple experiences where I thought, okay, I'm here researching the wolf as a researcher, as a journalist, as a reporter. Like I'm on a train and I'm just doing this with my scientific hat on. And then maybe I had an experience with sort of another passenger on the train that was threatening to me, and I go into it in the book, but suddenly it was like, well, that story is actually affecting my ability to talk about real wolves, that these symbolic stories are there. So yeah, I think Little Red Riding Hood, there were so many sides that once I sort of bent closer to that story and looked at it, I was thinking like, it's also the story of somebody who's really adored and somebody who the woodsman comes in and wants to save. And I started thinking about all of the women and, non-binary people and all of the victims who are not, nobody does want to step in for them, or culturally, they don't maybe occupy that same role as Little Red, who's cute and blonde and small and adored. And so what does that tell us about how bodies are protected, or who we protect? And so that story ended up feeling like it actually, if you pulled on one thread, it said a lot about other sort of societal narratives around predator and prey that I'd grown up with without really examining.
Which is interesting because you also talk about like how in like Nazi Germany, like Hitler kind of was like, I mean, there's a lot of propaganda, but like was sort of like elevated in various propaganda pieces as like the savior of Little Red Riding Hood. And I mean, there's all sorts of terrible subtext with that. Though we do know that specifically like the Grimm's fairy tales and everything Germanic, he tried to sort of adopt into like the cultural fabric of Germany being superior, whatever. I mean, it's just really interesting in general. And then like, so these are all like symbolic wolves and like how they've been used and sort of misused. You obviously like werewolves are a crazy that's like a whole sub topic that we can go into, but we don't have the time for. But I found that really interesting. But then at the same time, like you have what you going back to what you talked about in the beginning, the idea of reintroducing wolves into the wild and that being sort of controversial in and of itself. If you want to just chat a little bit about that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's so well said. Like there really are these two different strands, and I think in the book I wanted to bring in real wolves as well, like a real embodied. I wanted the reader to feel like they're maybe standing beside a wolf or kind of in the wolf's, almost like there's a sort of GoPro on the wolf's head to the degree that I can walk with this wolf, and also be aware that like you can't fully occupy that headspace. So real wolves kind of come in and out of this book almost the way that they do when I was following them in real life. Like if a wolf has a collar, which is what biologists will do for the state. Maybe there's a new wolf, they'll try to trap it and put a collar on it, and that collar then helps ranchers. They can get notifications like, hey, you get a text like this wolf OR 48 is coming towards your area, and maybe they can help gather their cows into an area. And it also helps biologists track where wolf packs are going and where they're maybe mating or if there's new pups and keeping count on populations. So that was happening in Oregon around the time that I started studying wolves, and I was very interested in sort of the way that that was talked about was often that wolves are coming back and they're supported by city dwelling environmentalists. I put this all in kind of air quotes. And the people rurally don't like wolves and feel threatened by them. And that was the kind of oversimplification that I saw. And, my grandfather he was from the Bay Area. He wasn't like a, multiple generations of Oregon farmer, but he also had sheep. And he had a herd of sheep. And my dad grew up like having to bring in these baby lambs that had been sort of attacked by coyotes and sewing them up in the barn. He has these memories of that. And I was never involved in something that hands-on, but I certainly I was intimately involved with the lambs and the sheep and all the farm animals growing up. And we'd, be nursing lambs in the bathtub. And I really understood the way that you could really love a farm animal, even if maybe that animal was destined for your freezer and you were going to eat it one day. You still loved it like a pet in some ways. And so that I felt like I was interested in sort of breaking down the idea of it just being a really simple narrative around who loved the wolf, who hated the wolf. And in fact, doing interviews for this, I met many livestock producers who were really in awe of the wolf as an animal. And one producer who actually had kept a wolf as a pet way back in the day when that was sort of more normalized, and like I never expected that. He'd lost a lot of cows to wolves, and he was still kind of marveling at them and also grieving at the effect of his livestock. So I was interested in highlighting those stories, because I do think as wolves are repopulating America. I think a wolf just stepped through New York maybe a couple months ago. There's some, the conversations are continuing, and I think we really need sort of other stories beside just um, this is two sides of a cultural divide in America fighting off. I was skeptical of that.
What are some of your favorite things that you sort of discovered pulling on these threads and going down these rabbit holes?
That's a great question. Yeah, curiosity is definitely my engine, I would say, as a writer. It's what most inspires me. I mean, there were some fascinating things. I'm thinking a little bit about early werewolf stories. I was trying to trace where those came from, for example. And one of the things I found was that, there was real evidence perhaps that people who thought they were wolves had ingested maybe a toxic plant, or there was questions around mental illness, even with some of these the stories around children perhaps being adopted by wolves, which maybe were sort of popularized in Rudyard Kipling. And there's some of those quite popular stories from the mid 20th century. There's now later questions about maybe those children were autistic and there were some of those signs. And so I became really interested in how narratives around wolves or werewolves actually were sort of a cloak to talk about things that were harder to talk about, mental illness or sexual assault. Like a woman has gone out, she's met a werewolf. Well, what actually did happen was like somebody who was legible at one point to her transformed and something violent happened, and then he's just the guy down the road again. And like, is that actually, that's a werewolf story too, but people weren't talking about that hundreds of years ago necessarily. So it became a way of sort of studying, in looking at the wolf, looking at these narratives around how we talk around fear and protection, and also just like these great evidence. Some questions around werewolves are also tied to rabies, for example. Like maybe this wolf had rabies and it was acting really erratic and charging people, and maybe that sort of it helped. It felt like a werewolf. And I learned that rabies hadn't really existed in the Americas until it came over with the colonists. So rabies itself was a sort of evidence of that colonialism and that danger towards the indigenous peoples here. And so all of the ways that it quickly became like this web of wolves, and the stories we tell about them is connected to so many larger factors, stories around gender and race and colonialism and nationalism and how statehood. So fascinating.
You talk a little bit, I mean, you were just mentioning the whole thing about like some people might have ingested some sort of toxin. I mean, you get the whole like berserker thing where, like people would go into battle ingesting something, and that's a whole other side to that too.
Yep, totally. I think this idea that we have a different self inside of us. There's this popular meme right now, like inside of you, there are two wolves. And I think that actually does come from sort of, it traces very far back that there's like this quote, civilized self and this like animal self. And I sort of don't believe that there's these two distinct selves, but you look at so many of these stories. I mean, what is a werewolf but like turning from oneself to another and then turning back? And like this idea, Barry Lopez in his wonderful book of Wolves and Men talks about the idea of theriophobia, which is like fear of the beast within oneself. And I thought about that a lot. Like we sometimes can't talk about violence in ourselves, so we like project it outward onto a wolf or say, this under the influence, I was this other creature. And that becomes a way of sort of separating it from this, quote, civilized self.
So this book was awesome. Are you writing something else right now? What are you up to now that this is about to come out soon?
Yeah, this has been a project for like 10 years. So I feel like there's a lot of just like a dog like shaking the water off after a bath. I'm like still got all these wolf facts clinging to me that I'm thinking around. But I am interested now. In some ways, I wrote this book when I was in a very anxious period in my own life, and I was trying to grapple with the way I thought about fear and why I thought about it. And now I'm thinking about love, which in some ways is like what comes after fear, like that idea of connection to others, and that as a sort of unifying force. So I'm thinking about love and uncertainty and environmental change, and I guess that's all I'll say right now. But similarly, kind of thinking across disciplines and in some of these different modes. So
Very cool. I want to thank you so much. This was really interesting. It was again, it was one of those that when it came up, I was like, this sounds like a really refreshing read. And I love that you talk a little bit about fear. I mean, the last few years, the pandemic in general and this unseen fear, it's been pretty prominent. And I think that, it's really interesting to sort of go back and look at it from that perspective.
Well, thank you for saying that. I'm glad it resonated. And I do think, unfortunately, we are in a moment where sort of the uncertainty of what is out there is really clear. And I think it was actually helpful to read some of these early stories about sort of uncertainty in the Middle Ages and how, like, the wolf as a representation of the threat became sort of a political tool because it was easier than talking about another fear. And I think, plagues and illnesses were for a long time associated with wolves, kind of linguistically, and also saying, oh, the wolves are going to bring the plague in because they're eating the dead bodies. And like the sort of metaphors of wolves and sickness, it was pretty interesting to work on this book during the pandemic. And I hope that we're going to live with wolves in a different, a different way now. But yeah, I would love to help people think about their own relationship with fear and maybe at what cost they carry that fear to the world. Where did they learn that from? And is it worth carrying or worth examining more?
Thank you so much. Once again, this was Jessica with Turn the Page podcast. My guest was
Erica Berry. Thanks so much,
You're
Jessica.
welcome. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.